Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to be discussing my worst books and my most disappointing books that I read and or DNF'd in the year 2022. So this is the complete opposite of Monday's video where I talk about the best books that I read in 2022. For this video, it's going to be the worst books. Books that I thought were going to be good, but turned out to be crap. Yeah. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I've got my list here, and I think the order that I did this is just order that I read them in, so January through December. So these aren't in any sort of particular order, but if there's any like egregious ones where I'm just like, this was the worst book or like the most disappointing, I'll probably go ahead and point that out. But let's go ahead and start with The Therapist by B.A. Paris. Now, this book is what made me just stop reading B.A. Paris, because even though one of her books, Behind Closed Doors, is one of my all-time favorite thrillers, 5 stars, I love that book. Just the other books that I've tried to read by her have just been just very subpar. Like, just either they're extremely boring, no good characters, or it's super predictable. Like, it's just a shadow of what Behind Closed Doors was, which was amazing. So The Therapist, I think I gave it 2 stars. I was so bored with that book, and just, I'm done with B.A. Paris. Speaking of potential one-hit wonders, we have Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins. And again, Rachel Hawkins wrote The Wife Upstairs, which is, again, one of my all-time favorite thrillers. I gave it 5 stars. And I was super excited to read Reckless Girls because it has a pretty fun premise. And admittedly, it does start out pretty interesting. Not with any like great characters, but characters that you just kind of want to see have bad stuff happen to them. But just the second half of the book and just the directions it goes in and how wonky and batshit it is, I just did not enjoy it. I gave it 2 stars. Definitely one of the least favorite books that I read in 2022. And the next book that I have to talk about isn't necessarily one of my least favorite books, but it was pretty disappointing, and that would be The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Now, I gave this book 3 stars, so it wasn't terrible, and it's better than the other 2 Neil Gaiman books that I tried to read that I DNF'd. I think it was American Gods and Good Omens. I didn't really love either of those. The Ocean at the End of the Lane was fine. Like, I gave it 3 stars. It had its good and great moments, but overall, it just didn't really leave that much of a lasting impression. I just don't think I'm really that big of a Neil Gaiman fan. And I know people love this book, and that's what got me excited, because so many people, so many of my friends give it 5 stars, and I was super excited for it. But overall, it was just fairly disappointing. Not a terrible book, but definitely not a great book for me. The next book I have to talk about is The Appeal by Janice Hallett, I think. This one is in the unique category of most disappointing and least favorite. I DNF'd this right around the 50% mark, and I was super baffled by why people loved this book, and I was super mad that nothing was happening. It's uniquely written in that all of the book is written through emails, I think, and basically like it's just characters like emailing back and forth, and it's supposed to be like a collection of them that lawyers are going through to figure out what has happened. The problem is that nothing happens. It's a 500-page book, and I believe I got like 250 pages in. There's no murder. It's supposed to be like a murder mystery. We haven't figured out. I was so disappointed, and I really, at one point, I was literally just hate reading it, and I was just like, am I going to hate read this whole book? And I just decided, no, I'm not going to put myself through that. But yeah, I was just so disappointed. There was no murder. It's a murder mystery. Get halfway through the book, no murder. Ugh. Another one of my disappointing reads of the year is Exhalation by Ted Zhang. Now, this is much more of a me problem than a problem that I have with the author. I don't really love sci-fi that's only like technically based and it's all about the idea and not really at all about the characters. That's why I struggle with most of classic sci-fi. But Ted Chiang is supposed to be sort of like a modern sci-fi author, but he still uses that convention of like, oh, it's mainly about the ideas and just grasping with like technologically advanced stuff and how that would, and like philosophizing, if that's even a word. See, I'm not smart enough for this. But anyway, I was reading a couple of the stories in there and I just wasn't jiving with really any of them. So it's definitely more of a me problem. I just don't really like that style of science fiction writing. So I did DNF it. Definitely one of the more disappointing books. But yeah, it's more of a me problem. Another one of my more disappointing thrillers of the year, and definitely a lot of these are thrillers, which is kind of sad because I read so many great thrillers, but this one was not great. In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This book was brought to my attention from Stacy, and this was actually one of the books that she read to me, and we both really didn't have a great time with it. It had a pretty good premise, and the characters were somewhat interesting, but the author's just world building, which is a weird word to use for thrillers because thrillers often take place in our world. So like, what's the build? But this author like writes in two different timelines. One of them is supposed to be modern day, and then the other one is supposed to be like late 2000s, early 2010s. But the stuff and the references that she uses made it seem like it was written in like the 80s or 90s. Because at one point, like you're on a college campus in the 2000s, and someone is walking around with a damn boombox. You're like, what is this? Like the author is like so out of touch. And also just the reveals at the end really didn't make that much sense logically. And it was just all over the place. So it had some good moments, some good character stuff. But overall, the book was just a mess. I think I gave it like 2.5 or 3 stars. Definitely one of the more disappointing books of 2022. One of my least favorite books that I attempted to read, I did not finish this book, was the audiobook for All Systems Red by Martha Wells. It's just one of those baffling books that I really don't understand why people love it. You've got those books like, Abercrombie. Like, I can sort of understand why people love him, even though I really don't. But for this book, All Systems Red, I think I listened to like an hour of it, maybe even less. And I just did not understand. I was so baffled. I did not think it was funny. I did not think it was interesting. I just did not give a crap. And people rave about Murderbot. I couldn't care less. Another one of my most disappointing reads of the year was The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which was surprising because I had previously read one of his books, No Country for Old Men, and I really enjoyed that. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed the dialogue in that book, but for some reason, The Road just had horrendous dialogue, and just, it's one of those books again that I just don't understand. I mean, I get where people are coming from, because if you read that book as a parent, like there's a father-son relationship in it, I can kind of understand, but it was so boring for most of it. Like, not a terrible book. Like, I gave it 2.5 stars, but most of that book, man, just was so bad. The dialogue was horrendous, like I said, which was surprising because No Country for Old Men had really great dialogue, like outstanding dialogue. But The Road just did not work for me. I gave it 2.5 stars. One of the most overrated books I've ever read. And now we're back on to most disappointing thrillers. The next one is The Island by Adrian McKenty. And I had read his previous book, The Chain, which I actually really enjoyed. Not a perfect novel, but really good. Like the first 2/3 of that book are just excellent and just pulse pounding. and it was just excellent. The Island, uh, it has some wonky moments and some illogical moments, and it had a pretty cool premise. Not really original by any means, but like, a family kind of is being hunted down by these crazy Australians, essentially. It's a pretty fun premise, but there's just so much illogical stuff that happens. It's just wonky. It's a wonky book. It's fun at times, but overall, it's just not a great book. I gave it 2.5 stars. Now, this next book is easily like one of the most disappointing and one of the worst books that I read. I didn't finish it. I almost finished it. I DNF'd it at 80%. And that would be Hide by Kirsten White. And again, this is another book that me and Stacy were buddy reading together. She was reading it to me because she had the physical copy. And it's another one of those books that just has such a great premise. Like it's supposed to be a giant game of hide and seek in an abandoned amusement park, and whoever wins like gets a bunch of money, right? And it's supposed to be like, oh, what's happening to these people? Like they're going missing and blah blah blah. But it's not really that at all. It's marketed as a horror book, but really it's more of like a YA mystery romance bullcrap. And it was so boring. It was not good. And the moment where I DNF'd it was just so outrageous. I was just like, nope, I'm done. And Stacy, of course, finished it because she actually bought the book, or someone gifted it to her. But just even hearing the summary of the last 20%, I am so glad I did not finish that piece of crap. Easily one of the worst books that I tried to read in 2022. Horrible. And now we come to the worst book that I actually finished in 2022. And that would be Floppy Shoes Apocalypse, which this is just a little tiny, like 40-page or 50-page story about, I don't even really want to talk about this. It's an erotic clown horror book, and it's fucking awful. It's horrendous. And you're probably asking, like, why did you read that? I lost a book bet with Stacy, and I don't even remember what the book bet was, but I lost it, and she made me read this. Because I got gifted this book as a joke, because I, like, jokingly put it in my wish list, but Patrick actually bought it for me. And I lost a book bet, and I had to read it, and it was awful. 1 star, it was just so bad. Like obviously from the premise, it's like an erotic clown horror. So it's not very promising to begin with, but it's even worse than you can imagine. It was so bad, and yeah, easily the worst book that I read. This next book was fairly disappointing, even though it had a promising start to it, and that would be Dead Woman Scorned by Michael C. Clarke. And this book is the sequel to Patience of a Dead Man, which was actually pretty good. And it's actually the book before the third book. That's a dumb thing to say. It's the second book. And the third book was actually quite good. I can't remember the name of it, but that one I gave 4 stars. Dead Woman Scorned, it has a wonky writing structure to it, I guess. Like the first book, I don't know, it's like 300 pages with like maybe 60 chapters. It's pretty even pacing, pretty good characters. Dead Woman Scorned is actually somewhat of a prequel, and the prequel stuff is actually pretty good about like the backstory of a character. That part's pretty good. But then it flashes back to modern day and adds some new characters. A lot of it I just didn't care about. And also the writing style, it's again around the same length of the first book, but it has 200 chapters, which is insane for a 300-page book. So a lot of these chapters just felt like nothing happened, or it was meaningless, or it just didn't really add anything to the story. So yeah, it was pretty disappointing, but at least the third book kind of made up for it. You've probably been noticing that a lot of these books I've had to put on screen here because I don't own them, because I've gotten rid of them. But for this next author, who you can probably guess who it is, I collect all of his books even if I don't like them, and I keep them even if I don't like them, just because why not? But these books I really did not enjoy, and that would be Wendys Magic Feather, which is actually solely written by Richard Chismar, but it's halfway Stephen King-ish. And then Gwendy's Final Task, co-written by Stephen King and Richard Chismar. Both of these books suck, which is disappointing because I really enjoy Gwendy's Button Box. One of the best Stephen King novellas of all time, in my opinion. But good God, Magic Feather, again, I think I have a problem with really short, choppy chapters. Like, this book is, I don't know, it's like 200 pages, but it has like 80 chapters, which a lot of these chapters, nothing happens or nothing of significance happens, and it just feels like a complete waste of time. So I gave this one 2 stars. I really did not enjoy it. Gwendy's Final Task, at least like stuff happens, which is probably its biggest compliment. But what happens is kind of stupid, and I'm not really a fan. I mean, it's got some Dark Tower stuff in it, which is fine. But at the same time, just overall, both of these just kind of ruin Button Box for me. So definitely one of my least favorite and most disappointing books of the year. And we can keep the Stephen King train rolling along because this was probably my biggest disappointment of the year. Of course, Stephen King, one of my favorite authors of all time, so I'm always excited to read his newest book. And I was super excited for Fairy Tale. But sadly enough, me and a slew of other people felt the same way about this book. The first 200 pages of this book or so are excellent. It's classic Stephen King, and it's just really well written. And then the last half of the book is just not. And I mean, I have a dedicated book review for this. So if you want to go check out like all of my thoughts on this book, go check that out. But overall, it starts out really well, and just the direction it goes in, and once it actually gets to the fantasy portal stuff, it just drops off a cliff, and it's not very good. So definitely one of, if not the most disappointing book of 2022 for me. One of my new favorite horror authors is Stephen Graham Jones, and I've pretty much enjoyed everything that he's written. Some of them have been like 4 or 5 stars. A few of them have been, 3, 3.5. Everything has been good, except for The Babysitter Lives. I believe I gave this 2.5 stars, and this was an audio only on either Audible or Scribd. And I really think I would have enjoyed it more if I had the paperback version, because just the nature of this story, and like some of his other books, it's such a fever dream that only listening to it on audio while I'm trying to do other stuff like around the house or in the yard or whatever, it's so disorienting that you're like, you get through some chapters and you're just like, what is even happening? What has happened? What is going on? Why are we doing this? And it's just such a disorienting novel that I really didn't really have that good time with it. And it's definitely the worst Stephen Graham Jones book to date that I've read. I still have more to read, but yeah, it was fairly disappointing. This next book was written by an author who was actually mentioned in my best of 2022 reads. He wrote one of the best books that I read in 2022, and that would be Riley Sager. And which book is it? It is The Last Time I Lied. This book is definitely the worst Riley Sager book I've read to date. I mean, it's not terrible. I gave it 2.5 stars. I didn't really enjoy the character and just the progression of the story and where it went. I didn't love. And like I said, definitely the worst that I've read so far. And the ending was fine. I could kind of see it coming. He definitely has better books. House Across the Lake is obviously his best in my mind. But even Home Before Dark and Survive the Night were leagues better than this one. One of the most disappointing fantasy books that I read, because a lot of these have been thrillers, but one of the most disappointing fantasies has to be The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Bullman. Now, this book isn't necessarily bad. I'm not going to call it a terrible book. It's personal for me because I'm not a huge fan of when stories, like, stuff happens in every chapter, but so much is happening that it doesn't feel significant, right? Like in this book, I like the main character, and I loved the narration of the audiobook, who was actually narrated by Christopher Bullman himself. But just every chapter, this character is getting into something, right? And it just doesn't feel realistic to me. and it's also just like just bouncing around from place to place, event to event. There's like 60 chapters, and I feel like there's just like 30 things that happen in the book, and you're just like, can we take a breather? Like it's hard to remember all that stuff, and just with so much happening, it doesn't feel significant to me, which is a shame because I really liked that character, but just the way that the story was written was not in my favor. And the last book that I have to talk about, apparently I had a lot of disappointing books, and this was definitely one of them, is Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. Now, I loved the first book, Vicious. I gave that book 5 stars. I'm pretty sure I read that in one sitting. It was so good, and I loved it. I loved the villain rivalry in that book. But with Vengeful, it was just so, I don't even know. It was just different. Like, you didn't really get that rivalry like you get in the first book. You follow a bunch of new characters that I really didn't care about, and you do follow the same, like Victor and Eli, but they're separate and they're doing their own thing, and it was just boring. And also, like, I love stories with time jumps, but good God, like every chapter, like, 15 years earlier, 2 years earlier, 2 weeks earlier, 10 years earlier. It's just like, Jesus Christ, can we pick a timeline, people? Oh, man. And like I said, I love, like, alternating timelines, but good God, just every other chapter, just like 15 years, 10 years, 3 years, 15. Oh, my God. But yeah, it was just a vast contrast between Vicious, which I loved, and then Vengeful, which I DNF'd probably around 50%. Whew. All right, if I am not forgetting anything, and God hope I'm not, those are my most disappointing books and the worst books that I read in 2022. And I had a lot of them. I hated a lot of these books, but at the same time, some of these were just books that I thought were going to be tremendous, but ended up being like 2-3 star books. And yeah, hopefully in 2023 I have a lot less of those, but I can already tell you that's probably not going to happen, because in January I've already had a few fairly disappointing books and a DNF, so probably I'll be doing the same video a year from now, and I'll be complaining even more. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed me ranting about some books that I really didn't enjoy. Please let me know what you thought of the books that I ranted about here. Do you agree with me on some of these books and you think they're overrated as well? Or do you disagree with me and they're some of your favorite books of all time? Please let me know down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me, go check my Patreon page and my Amazon wish list. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day. I don't know what I'm doing there.